I am Jennifer Boyat. Welcome to the Rise of the Peacemaker, a conversation with leading peacemakers. It is time for our leaders to be peacemakers and for our peacemakers to be our leaders. That means you, Rise Peacemaker. I want you to know that there are peacemakers all over the world, like you, whose influence may be small, medium, large, and they wake up every morning and they live their calling as you do. And you're not alone. You found us. And we have a wonderful moment to sit in circle today with important examples and leaders, and to be fed and taught and gain insights about how we can activate peace and goodness and joy in our lives and in the lives of those we serve. And I would like to introduce to you Dr. Riane Eisler. Dr. Eisler is, first of all, a recipient of the Distinguished Peace Leadership Award. She is an author. She's written books, many books, including The Chalice and the Blade, Nurturing Our Humanity, The Real Wealth of Nations. She is the president of the Center for Partnership Systems and a professor, a distinguished professor at the Meridian University. And in all of these avenues, she is teaching us about partnerism, a better way to organize our economics, and to dissolve the domination systems that have been our habit in our societies throughout history and up till this day. Welcome, Dr. Eisler.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yes. And I'd also like to welcome Frederick Murphy, who serves his community as a licensed mental health counselor and is also nurturing his passion project, which goes by the name of History Before Us. And he's created some films, documentary films. And he, through these films and the project entire, he's recovering stories and history and truth, particularly regarding the Black experience in the United States. And that is laying the foundation for reconciliations based on truth and reality. Welcome, Murph.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate it. And
so let's begin by letting each of you introduce yourselves a little more deeply, and talk about what you consider to be your work and your calling in this world, how you would describe it, and going along with that, how it is that you chose that work, or it chose you, how you arrived at that work. And would you like to start us off, Dr. Eisler?
Certainly. Well, we've been used to thinking as peace as just an interval between wars, but that's not really what peace is about. And the question for us is very simple. We know from neuroscience that nothing less than the structure of the human brain, and hence how we feel, how we think, how we act, including how we vote, develops in interaction with our environment, which for humans is primarily cultural. So the question is really comes down to what kind of culture will support our enormous human capacities for consciousness, for caring, for creativity, rather than supporting and really suppressing the first set, supporting our capacities for insensitivity, cruelty, destructiveness, because we clearly also have those. And that is my passion. That is the subject of my work. That inquiry really is rooted in my own personal experiences as a very young child, as a refugee child with my parents from the Nazis, from my native Vienna. And we really only escaped by a hair's breadth. And I had to ask myself this question, is it true? You know, the story that we're told, original sin or selfish genes, that it's inevitable. That's just how it is, right? You know, the caveman cartoon, you know, in one hand, he's got a weapon, a club, other hand, he's dragging a woman by the hair. So what does it say? It says violence, male dominance, injustice. That's just human nature. That is a false story. And the evidence that we are now having from archaeology, from anthropology, from linguistics, from mythology, is, well, for example, archaeology shows that war is at most 5,000 to 10,000 years old. I mean, think about that. I'm going to close with this. My most recent book, Nurturing Our Humanity, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2019, I wrote it, I had been working on it for about 7 years, because it takes me a long time to do the research for my books. And then I invited my co-author, the anthropologist, Douglas Fry. And one reason I invited Doug to be my co-author is that he is probably one of the world authorities on how we humans lived for millennia as foragers. And he calls them the original partnership rather than domination societies. They were more equitable, more egalitarian, more peaceful, more gender balanced. And so my work has been really trying to answer, as I said, that question, what social configurations do we really need to build for us to move to a more peaceful, more equitable, more sustainable world? And I will go into that later, but looking at a more complete picture, which includes the whole of humanity, which are basically ignored or marginalized in most studies, women and children, not to speak of other outgroups, depending on where we are on this globe. And also looking at the whole span of our history, including our prehistory, I kept seeing patterns, configurations that keep repeating themselves. And there were no names for them. So I called one the domination system and the other one the partnership system. And if we really want a more peaceful world, not ideal, not completely violence-free, but where violence doesn't have to be built into the system to maintain these rigid top-down rankings, man over man, man over woman, religion over religion, race over race, humans over nature, we really have to understand these configurations and what we have to build so that we have the foundations for cultures of partnership and peace.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's interesting that you're bringing in history as well. And I'll bet Merv has some more things to say to us about that. That's interesting where we're beginning with that. Merv, tell us again, about what you consider your work to be and how you came to that.
Yeah, so along the same lines, with looking at things from a humanity standpoint, everything that I feel like I do is rooted in that. And that's what I define peace is when everyone considers humanity, right? And not only humanity, but also the earth. We would not be able to sustain life. We wouldn't be able to sustain humanity if it wasn't for the earth, the ecosystem, like everything, right? So for me, getting into this work in creating documentaries and sharing stories was pretty much rooted in me being very inquisitive as a kid talking with my grandmother and great grandmother about their experiences as sharecroppers in the Jim Crow South and how they were part of the migration out of the South to Illinois, and an unfortunate death of my grandmother's brother being hanged in 1965 um, for dating a young white female classmate. And her father was her uncle was the sheriff of this small town, and no one served a day in jail, and it just wreaked havoc on the family. And my family is a long line of nurses, CNAs, caretakers of other individuals. My mother took care of folks. My grandmother, all my aunts, they usually went into people's homes in a rural town and took care of people. So it was kind of, embedded in my DNA to do this type of work. So fast forwarding, I went on to college, got my got an undergrad in psychology, a master's in professional counseling, and another one in transformative leadership. And I became burnt out at roughly around 2016. I've been practicing in the field of counseling since 2004, and just seeing so much, just vicarious trauma. And even though you're in the field of being a therapist or a medical doctor or a nurse practitioner, et cetera, that does not mean that you are not subject to absorb some of these things that other people are feeling, because we do. And that's why self-care is not only important for us, but for everyone. But because I got burnt out, I had to find some type of balance as far as intentional self-care. And I'm a big believer that if sometimes we can jog back our memory to where things were very euphoric for us, when we didn't have a care in the world, and if we're able to incorporate some of that into our present day, then that can assist us with what it is that we need to do, or what it is that we should do to provide some balance. And oral history did that for me. Sitting around the table, eavesdropping on the old folks, quote unquote, stories is what did that for me. So I decided to incorporate that back into my life, present day, and started doing the documentaries. The very first one was titled The American South as We Know It, where I traveled throughout the South, interviewing individuals who survived Jim Crow and getting their specified experiences on what that looked like. And I started recognizing that I literally married my passion with what it is that I've learned from a technical level. And people who haven't talked about some of these things in 30 years, 40 years are purging. And you're seeing that they're becoming lighter and lighter, right? The weight is being lifted off. And then when you ask, why haven't you, when's the last time you've talked about this kind of stuff? They say it's been 30 years, 40 years, 20 years. And then when you ask, well, why haven't you, spoken about this on, more assertive level? And some simply just say, no one's asked. And I'm just like, man, we can do so much self-healing with each other by inquiring about our humanity, about our lived experience. And so I've taken that stance, and in my speaking engagements, when I go across the country, I have people from various different ethnic backgrounds, gender backgrounds, race backgrounds, et cetera, and we sit there and we create a safe space for individuals to be as vulnerable as possible. And you'll just be amazed by how so many people share the same experiences. They just look a little bit different. And also understanding that some of this different and how it's looked has been created by different policies and laws that have been created throughout time and in this country, which has unfortunately created this hierarchy that should not be there, right? My skin color or where I lived or how I talk, et cetera, should not make me less of a person than you, nor should it threaten my existence. My existence shouldn't threaten anyone as well. And that goes for everyone, whether you're a woman, whether you're a male, whether you're transgender, et cetera. We have to look at this short time that we're borrowing here on Earth as an opportunity to pay our debt to everyone and pay it forward for future generations by considering humanity and giving them as much as we can in order to make things easier for the next generation. So that's what my work is rooted in. And I hope that the individuals who've come across my work up until this point has been inspired by it and spreads the same message.
Thank you. So you're doing a deep dive into the artifacts and the fallout from domination systems, I think, that Dr. Eisler has described. So what I'd like to have you maybe speak to now is, a lot of times we ask what we can do for peace, what's something positive we can do, but I'd actually like to ask it in the other direction. What do you think is in the way, like whether it's personal or maybe more societal, but what do you think are maybe is a misunderstanding we have, or a habit we have, or a paradigm that just seems to stick, something we need to release that gets in the way of peace? I don't know if you can understand where I'm trying to go with that, but that one barrier or something, like if we could just take that, nothing's just one thing. It's always more complex than that. But if there's just that one thing we could take away that would help us make that leap. What do you think, Fred?
You have mansions, you have shotgun houses, you have Rolls Royces, the car, and then you may have Toyota, you have Whole Foods, and then you have a budget-friendly grocery store, you have Nikes, then you have maybe some shoes that you get from the Dollar General, right? Like, and this analogy is just to identify the disparities that have been created in this country in regards to access. And what I feel we do as human beings is, the higher the access points that a certain group of individuals have, the less visible those who can't achieve those things become. So we've created this hierarchy in regards to monetary things, materialistic things, that in the grand scheme of things are very superficial whenever it's our time to leave this earth, because none of that stuff matters anymore. So there's this gray area in between that we're completely missing, because we've created this black and white society, and not from a colorism standpoint, but in regards to what is deemed good and what's deemed bad. When the reality is, I came in this world and everyone came in this world the same, naked, connected to an umbilical cord, if it's a traditional birth. And that's how we began. And then you get thrust into this society that has these different levels to it that determine where you are on the totem pole, quote unquote, if you will. So I think that we're in the matrix, if you will, to where it's this rat race, to where so many people are racing to defy themselves, to create their sense of self-worth based on materialistic things, based on where you live at, or based on your level of education, et cetera, when sometimes that can be very harmful if you completely forget about individuals that may not be able to have the same resources, or lived experience may not have been the same throughout their lived experience in life as well. So that may not be all of why we are at where we're at in this country, in politics, with food deserts, just living wage disparities, et cetera. But I do believe that because there is a culture of the have and the have-nots, that it sometimes creates a divisiveness that is just not savory for the human race.
Thank you. And that's what I love, what I've, the reading that I've just started to try to learn from Dr. Eisler is, I think a lot of what she does actually could help us in all of those things. But Dr. Eisler, what would you say is the barrier to peace, if there's one?
Well, I'm very interested in what of my work you're reading, Jennifer.
I'm in the middle of The Real Wealth of Nations. Oh yeah, the
well, that is
partnerism.
the book that I wrote to really suggest that we need to go beyond both capitalism and socialism, which of course came out of early industrial times, in the 1700s and 1800s, and we're today in the 21st century post-industrial age. So on that count alone, they'd be antiquated, but it's more than that. They came out of times that still oriented more to the domination side of the partnership domination social scale. And there's nothing in either capitalism or socialist theory about caring for nature. I mean, for both Marx and Smith, nature was there to be exploited. Not only that, they made a distinction. You know, you talked about a family tradition, Frederick, of caregiving. As far as they were concerned, caring for children in households, caring for the sick, caring for the elderly, that was just reproductive women's work to be done for free by a woman in a male-controlled household. So much so that even as late as when Marx wrote in the mid-1800s, a woman in most places could not sue for injuries inflicted on her. Only her husband could for loss of her services. I mean, so when you're talking about this hierarchy of domination, because I make a distinction, well, the book that I'm best known for is The Chalice and the Blade. And the chalice is powerful. And the blade is powerful, but they're very different powers. The blade is, well, it's the power to dominate, to control, to take life. The chalice is the power to nurture life, to give life, to illuminate life. And so I make a distinction between these two kinds of powers with societies that orient more to the domination configuration, seeing power over as the power, how you define power, how you define leadership, whereas in more partnership-oriented societies, it's both power to, creative power, and power with. But when you ask me what is the obstacle, I'm a systems scientist, and I think in terms of system configurations. So if you have the configuration of the domination system, whether it is in the Jim Crow era here in the United States, whether it's the Taliban today, again in Afghanistan, whether it was Hitler in Nazi Germany or Stalin in the former Soviet Union, right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, they all have more or less the domination configuration of top-down rankings in both the family and authoritarian, highly punitive, painful, trauma-causing family in both the family and the state or tribe. And you certainly have experienced that in your family, both, you know, so much. And they also rank one half of humanity, the male half over the female half. You know, that is not coincidental that whether it was the Taliban or Nazi Germany or Khomeini in Iran, or the so-called pre-antebellum South, they all had the same concept of real masculinity being defined as domination, violence over what they consider built-in femininity. You know, that's how women have to be, you know, caring, caregiving. So we have a gendered system of values where there's always money for prisons, you know, the punitive male head of household, right?
Yep.
Or for weapons and wars, the hero as killer, as warrior, but somehow there isn't enough money for caring for people, for caring for nature, for childcare, for child nutrition, I mean, for the basics. And this is not only anti-human, but getting back to the real wealth of nations, it creates artificial scarcity. not only by misdistribution of resources to those on top of these domination hierarchies, but by failing to invest in caregiving and caring. And of course, by siphoning off a lot of resources, because it's a question of priorities, not of resources, into prisons, into punishment, basically, and conquest and domination. So violence is built into domination systems because it's essential to maintain these rigid rankings of domination. And whether it's a materialistic culture like the United States or a so-called religious culture like the Taliban, it doesn't really matter. Or whether it's communist or rightist or leftist. I mean, what we're talking about is a configuration. And we have to change our metrics. That's the first step, because GDP replicates this whole notion that it's only productive work counts, and what they consider productive, like, includes not only, well, it includes activities that harm and take life, like selling cigarettes, and the resulting medical and funeral bills. They're all tremendous for GDP. Cutting down trees on which we depend for breath only appear in GDP when they're chopped down, when they're dead. I mean, think of it, it's crazy. So metrics, and we're working on some new metrics that show the economic value of caring for people starting at birth and caring for our natural life support systems. But so what I'm really trying to say is that we have to pay attention to matters that we have been socialized to think of as marginal or unimportant, as just women's issues, just children's issues, and we have to go deeper and wider. And I have introduced 4 cornerstones that we must have to shift them from domination to partnership. One is childhood, because of what I said neuroscience shows. And domination families, like domination economics, are trauma factories, like the in-group versus out-group thinking, whether it's racism in the United States or anti-Semitism when I was a little girl in Europe, or Shia versus Sunni, or Sunni versus Shia in the Middle East. It's always the out-group that's blamed, which is built into the system. So we've got to understand what we are really dealing with goes deeper than these very fragmenting categories that we're taught to think in, number one. And we have to change the reward system. And fortunately, there are many trends in that direction, as you know. Policies to reward childcare, policies like paid parental leave, policies that really are to equalize in the United States the situation of those who have been structurally disempowered, like Black people, people of color. But they're all part of the movement towards partnership. And we have to take a whole systems approach. So that is what my work is about. And I think that we have to move to what I call a caring economics of partnerism. But we have to pay attention to childhood, to gender, to this shifting economic rewards and measurements, and of course to stories and to language, because we humans live by stories. And as I said, that story that there's something wrong with us and that the only 2 alternatives are either dominating or being dominated. Trump said it. He said it's all about domination. And for him, that's the truth. There is for him no partnership alternative. And that's why we also have to pay attention to childhood, to gender, to economics and the rewards and the metrics, and to story and language.
I really agree with that, especially the story and language. I've often thought we need to re-story the world, because one person's mutiny is another person's freedom fight, and then if we can make a story that actually includes everyone instead of the division. But so this is wonderful, and we can let's see. I would like us to maybe share something that maybe on a personal individual level, if there's someone listening or as they listen, that in the next 24 hours you can do this, that might take us that step on a very personal level to peace. It could be personal peace, maybe even some personal philosophies that you have about that way, or if it's something to contribute to their community, but just something that could even be brought down to a very, I can do that. Dr. Eisler.
Well, I think that it's about, it all starts with changes in consciousness. I remember when we started, I mentioned the caveman cartoon, right?
Mhm.
The weapon in one hand, dragging the woman by the hair with the other. It tells domination is always been that way, by definition, then always will be. And that is a false story. So what all of us can do is to educate ourselves that there is actually that this is a false story, and that, for example, neuroscience shows that given half a chance, our, the pleasure centers in our brains, they light up more when we share and care than when we dominate and win. I mean, we get endorphins for caring, whether it's for a friend, for a child, for a pet. I mean, that's built into us as human beings through the grace of evolution. So we can all start by educating ourselves on the new evidence that has been largely suppressed and continues to be suppressed, of what human nature is really all about and how it gets distorted by all the traumas inherent in domination systems, starting in the family, going to economics, to racism, to sexism. I mean, this is all built into the system. It's ranking, and hierarchies of domination, where if you don't obey, there's a lot of pain, even death, as you so tragically related about a member of your family. I mean, that is, but I'll tell you something, and I want to end with that. We also need to really know our history, because if we look at modern history, during this period of disequilibrium, okay, of the shift from agrarian to industrial society, which was a slow shift. For the last 300 years, we have seen one progressive movement after another challenging the same thing, a tradition of domination, whether it was challenging the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule their quote subjects, or the feminist movement challenging the so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule over women and children, whether it was the abolitionists, civil rights, Black Lives Matter movements challenging, again, another so-called divinely ordained right of a so-called superior race to rule over inferior one, all the way to the environmental movement, challenging our once hallowed conquest and domination of nature, which at our level of technology and population could destroy our natural, I mean, life will go on, but our species may not, is what it really amounts to. But we haven't paid enough attention to these foundations, to really changing the gendered system of value, to really changing parenting styles. I mean, there's movement in that direction. We hear about authoritative rather than authoritarian. nonviolent rather than violent parenting. It's ridiculous to think, as so many of us have been taught, that spanking or hitting a small child is okay. You go to jail for doing that to an adult, but this dependent, small person, it's okay? I mean, come on, this makes absolutely no sense. So we have to, even the American Psychological Association finally came out a couple of years ago and said, not only is spanking ineffective in terms of discipline, you create rebellious, so-called bad children, right? But it is harmful psychologically and physically. There is movement, but we have to accelerate that movement in all four of the cornerstones. And then politics will follow, because once we no longer have this gendered system of values, we have different allocations of resources, don't we? And that's part of the struggle that's happening in this nation right now, isn't it? With those who suddenly are saying that was fine when we reduced taxes for the super rich, right? And created more deficits, but somehow investing money in caring for people, no, we don't have the money for that. I mean, that is built into their domination socialization. And so we can change that by simply changing. Not everybody will change, but the one thing about us, even though the first 5 years are foundational, as you know, we humans can change. But some people have been so traumatized, really, by the domination system that it's very hard for them. But they're very conformist. And if we can get leaders that they believe in, authority figures, to say, hey, partnership is more fun, partnership is more productive, all of which is true, by the way.
Yes.
And so that's our job to start with. But of course, our job isn't just changing our personal behaviors. It's, as you mentioned, Frederick, changing the social policies, the laws, the paradigm, the worldview. And we can be agents of that ourselves.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Eisler. Murph, what's your actionable advice?
Well, I'm a strong believer that conflict can facilitate change if you choose to, right? When we look at some of the atrocities that have happened in this country, when we look at Holocaust, when we look at indigenous groups, when we look at all of these different atrocities that have happened throughout this Earth's existence, those were moments of conflict, and people had to decide what the change was on the other side of that, right? And if you're able to move people exactly what was just said in a direction that promotes peace, that promotes a sense of harmonious nature, in where you don't have to expend so much energy remembering to hate a group of people because you have conformed to something that may have been prevalent in your environment or have been taught from childhood, and develop your own sense of gratification in regards to caretaking for another person, then you have the power to facilitate a positive change on the outside, on the other side of conflict, because conflict is always going to be present. It's what we do with it as human beings is what's going to determine, on the flip side of that, how well the outcome measures are based on that specific experience. So I always encourage people that sometimes we have to work from the micro community and hope that that work ripples to the macro community. So meaning being able to be autonomous in your neighborhoods, being autonomous in your school system, and changing the messaging that is divisive into something that's more positive, knowing that sometimes there's discord that may come with that for individuals that may not be on board, right? But from a humanistic standpoint, I just have a strong feeling that individuals get more gratification out of their day, not waking up remembering to hate somebody because of these variables that they've been having to live by for such a long time, versus partnering, right? Working together, being able to agree to disagree for the better good of everyone else. Because quite frankly, we have so much more that we can do with our time now as a society versus some of the things that we have been, I don't want to say wasting our time on, but essentially wasting our time on. For instance, this past week, I had at least 5 or 6 clients who have reached out to me and have asked for services. My caseload right now is packed. So I'm not able to see anyone for probably new clients for probably about 2 months. And I get, well, I've already called 6 other agencies or private practices, and they're telling me that I can't be seen for 6 more months. So what do I do with that? This is a problem. We can build $5 billion football stadiums in what was once impoverished neighborhoods, and send people to the moon and keep building private prisons, but we can't take care of our community's mental health. And this is people these are people who are seeking mental health, right? So I'm in the South, I'm in North Carolina, and it was very taboo to seek therapy, right? Normally you prayed about it and you go to the pastor, and then that's going to make everything fine. But people have evolved into understanding that these different services are needed, and they need to be participating in them in order for them to be able to sustain a fulfilled life. So for us to not have mental health services, for us not to have services that help assist people with food, to help assist people with rent, et cetera, because we've spent so much money on other things that go back into this superiority complex that really only serves a small number of individuals, then we're failing from a system standpoint, right? Which is what kind of been the theme in our conversation. So we have to check these systems, and we have to identify and understand that people in conjunction with nature is what makes this world work and makes this world go around, right? The ideas that we have to preserve the selflessness that the trees give in regards to our being able to breathe oxygen and all of these things. If we recognize that if we're working with these things in a more harmonious space and become more vulnerable and shed this superiority complex that this country has, and I'm speaking specifically in the United States, then we will become a better, this place will be a better place to live. And of course, that's not just a United States thing. This is all across the globe, but this is the hands that have been dealt, and it's going to take us individually in our immediate communities to make action happen in regards to positive change. And hopefully that spreads out to the macro community, and then we can have that kumbaya moment to where we have more people on the positive side versus the negative side of things.
Thank you. Well, we actually need to excuse one panelist and welcome another. But Dr. Eisler, I want to thank you so much for giving us your time. And is there anything else in your message that you really would like to impart before we have you leave us?
Well, I just want to say that if I sometimes say it as a joke, okay? But when I feel very depressed about the state of the world, you know, the Taliban now starting to say, oh, chopping off hands is very good, you know, because it keeps the peace, right? The peace. Wow. I think of the European Middle Ages. Why? Because it was only 300 years ago that we had a society that really looked quite a bit like the domination model of the Taliban. And, you know, the top down, you know, starting with this punitive deity, right? the male head of household, and this so-called, religious family, right? That, children were to be quiet, women were to be quiet, the witch burnings, the Inquisition, the Crusades. And we have, as I said, through these various movements, but we haven't moved enough. Because if you look at these progressive social movements that I mentioned, what has happened, they haven't paid enough attention to these four cornerstones, to childhood, and neuroscience is very clear now about the importance of that, to gender, and with it, not only this in-group versus out-group thinking, the equation of difference, starting with the difference in form between male and female, with superiority and inferiority, with dominating or being dominated, with being served or serving, which of course is a template for all, for racism, for anti-Semitism, for Shia versus Sunni or Sunni versus Shia, for, it's us against them, right? And we really have to pay attention to the gender system of values that comes out of that, which I've already emphasized. We're caregiving have been considered only feminine, which is nonsense. I mean, there are women who are uncaring and men who are caring. Caring is a human necessity. And of course, a caring economics of partnerism, starting with new metrics that show the economic value of caring for people and caring, starting at birth, and caring for our natural life support systems and changing the stories and language. So if we pay attention to those four cornerstones, at the same time that we continue to do whatever we're doing, but if we're conscious that these are foundational, I think there's a very good chance, but it has to be a global movement. And this is the difficulty here, because we're seeing, of course, a regression to domination in many places, including with Trump here in the United States, where 70 plus million people are in what is typical of domination systems: denial, climate change denial, election result denial, COVID-19 denial. It's all part of the dynamics of domination systems. But the more aware we are of what we really need to do, the more, cultures, economic systems, family norms, they're human creations. We can, and yes, we must change them. So as I said, people ask me if I'm optimistic, and I say I'm realistic, because it really depends on human agency. It depends on us, on you and me. So I thank you, and
Thank you.
I think we're all, in that sense, peacemakers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eisler. And yes, you're welcome to stay for as long as you can, but I know that you need to be excused as well, so that's up to you. But thank you so much and I hope everyone listening can follow what Dr. Eisler does and participate with her Center for Partnership Systems. And we'll talk more about that at the very end as well. But thank you, Dr. Eisler.
Yes, thank you for doing this, and goodbye.
We're actually going to welcome one more panelist and give her a chance to give a beautiful message that I've actually been looking forward to. Joan Blades is an author, an activist, and I first heard about her through her project, the LivingRoom Conversations, which uses a model, some conversation agreements to connect people across the human divides that we have across political age, gender, whatever it is, that where we're sometimes not able to talk to each other, but hopefully get to that place where we are. And I'm hoping she'll explain more about that. And actually, I was thinking, earlier, Murph was talking about that very thing, about him being able to open up people and bring different people to a table where things that had not been discussed, especially from history, traumatic history. And so this conversation piece, I think, is sometimes, it seems small, but it is the thing. And so, Joan, we are kind of coming to a close, but we'd love to hear what your work is, what you consider your work in the world, and how you chose it or it chose you.
Well, living room conversations are just 6 people agreeing to have a conversation together about a given topic where there's a set of conversation agreements, and a conversation guide that has 3 rounds. A first round where people talk a little bit about their deeper values. Second round that allows people to talk about their personal relationship with the topic at hand. And a close, which is just reflection and next steps. And we have guides on political polarization, race and equity, COVID, our deeper values. And in so many ways, these all intersect. And we have faith communities and libraries and individuals and clubs doing these conversations. I used to talk about this when it started over 10 years ago as a necessary for us to be able to do collaborative problem solving, because I was concerned about climate and believed that, only with everyone's best ideas in the room and that agility that comes from wanting to solve something and being focused on the same goals rather than focused on the fight, that it would be possible to do that. But I've learned a lot in the process of doing this. And we have political conversations that go from guns and responsibility to more curious, less furious. And more we have conversation pathways, because one conversation is wonderful, but an ongoing series of conversations allows people to go deeper. And it's really a listening practice that we are, grateful to leaders all around the country that take it and put it into use for themselves. And yes, I call it political domestic peace building these days. I have the most visibility on what's happening in the US. I know it's been used worldwide. I know it's been translated into many languages. Every now and then I hear about that. There was a whole use of them around the issue of tolerance for Worldwide Tolerance Day, I think it was, by one network. And I spoke to a woman who is a part of a network of mediators about using it around COVID. The core of this is the belief that we have to care about each other before we even hear each other. And once we start caring about each other, a vast number of things become possible. And that is the core. I started with a focus on climate change, but I've come to believe that I don't care so much what people talk about, just as long as they start talking and making those connections across difference. Because when we think of people as other, as in some ways allow ourselves to start thinking of them as less than in one way or another, that's how very bad things happen. So happy to go deeper on any of that, and my deep apologies for having been late to arrive here today. I'm looking forward to watching the recording so I get what I missed.
I'm actually so glad you're here. I definitely wanted your voice as part of this. And one of my pillars in how I have work with people or meet people is the food that we all want is acknowledgement, and we want to be seen and heard. And we can do that for ourselves if no one else will, but really we need to be doing it for each other. And I love that that both of you are in this, for lack of a better term, business of making conversations, because I'd like to maybe go there a little bit, Murph, and then Joan, but starting with Murph. It seems like it's really scary to have these conversations, but what have you learned about people's willingness or unwillingness as you've asked and approached, and also kind of maybe what happens after, like you have that conversation, and what gets maybe some surprising things that you wouldn't have known that happens after, or I'm not even sure what I'm saying, but it's not just the conversation. You carry that with you after. Go ahead, Murph.
I think that some people are tired of the old antiquated ways and structures of this country that essentially impedes on all of our ability to have upward mobility in a way that is genuine and organic, because of systems that they may have been taught that they just hold dear to just because this is the way that this person did it. And because of that only, I'm going to ride or die by it. And there's no sense of individualism that's involved in it. It's just solely because this is how it's always been done. And I think that with some of the individuals that I've met along the journey of creating various different documentaries and oral history gathering, is that people are finding it as a breath of fresh air to be able to purge and not necessarily follow the status quo that they've always been exposed to or felt like they have had to adhere to in order to be the person that everybody else around them wants. So you're finding that with the youth, with individuals. The youth usually always are the ones that lead the change. When we talk about the children's crusade down in Birmingham, Alabama, those parents had to go into the schools and pull their kids out of school and had to march and picket. So like when you see film footage as well as pictures of these kids being hosed with hoses and these dogs on these kids, 500 kids plus were jailed in Birmingham, Alabama. And it's usually kids or youth who take those lessons from their elders, who have the same ideology of peace, have the same ideology of what humanity looks like. And when our time expires, quote unquote, if you will, we look to our youth to be the ones to carry that torch, because people tend to be more empathetic towards a youthful figure versus someone who may have been around for a while. Now, to me, that doesn't make sense, but it's unfortunately the truth. That was the last resort that these folks did during the civil rights movement, during the Children's March. It's like, well, if we can't get it done with the adults who are articulating what it is that they need and how to say things correctly to move the needle, then let's utilize our kids. And the second they did that, it was across the globe, and the changes started happening, which led to one of the numerous civil rights bills being passed. So I think that people are getting tired of remembering that they have to hate somebody because of how they look, because of the way they talk, because of what region they're from. And I think that's because we're going further and further away from overt racism, overt things that overt genderism. Overt gender discrimination, et cetera, that now has become more covert because of the modality of communication in which it can be reported, right? i.e. social media and all these other things. So it's a mixed bag. You still have some that hold true to what it is and what has always been. And then you have some that are just like, you know what? It's fine. If they want to go to school with this person because that's just who they like, that's fine. If they want to date this person, fine. We have so many other things that's going on that we have to deal with, that we can stand to let go of a couple of things and be more flexible on certain issues. So that's what I'm finding, that some people are moving away from antiquated ways of doing things.
Yeah. And I think some of what we've been, in the last year and a half, I feel like what we've been hearing in the news a lot of times is that we can't talk to each other. That's been emphasized. And I'd like to challenge that there's actually a lot of us ready and available. But yeah, Joan, kind of go somewhere with that question.
It is true. There's more and more people that are recognizing we need that connection. And there's also a growing group that are saying, I don't want to talk to those people. And we're trying to give those people that are ready to talk tools to have really meaningful connections. And the beauty of this is you don't have to have everybody arrive in order to change culture. There's actually some science, social science, that suggests 3.5% of the population can create cultural change. And it does take, some courage to show up and have a conversation with people that are truly different than you, because we have self-sorted more and more around this country, where we are, very intentionally not spending time with people that think differently than we do. And when we are in those circumstances, not talking about anything much beyond the weather with the people that think different than we do, which is allowing us to live in separate narratives. Lots of people are now aware that we have news for the right and news for the left. One of our great partners is All Side, that provides us with news from across the political spectrum. And you look at the news on a day and you go, whoa, that's a different way of interpreting the exact same set of facts. Or it's even hard to talk about facts now because we're not sharing facts. And yet I continue to believe that there are facts. But human beings are very social creatures. And when we have a group that has a set of beliefs and you stray, the potential for being kicked out of the group feels very threatening to people. And that's why softening these boundaries is tremendously important right now. And it needs to be very intentional. So we're so grateful to individuals and groups that decide, yeah, I'm going to do this. We even have people, the original view for this is two people with different viewpoints, each invite two people for a living room conversation. So friends and friends and friends, you have these connections. Well, there are more and more people that say, I don't have anyone that is on the has the other perspective that I'm comfortable asking to co-host a conversation with me. And that's friends, neighbors, colleagues, because we've seen so much disrespectful and hostile exchange. People are batting down the hatches. Shifting to a norm of respect and connection is going to take people having the courage to connect. And then the beautiful thing about this is it's very satisfying. There's a new book that just came out about the power of strangers. And we have a conversation talking to strangers because there's all this research now that shows people that have connections with people that are outside of their comfort group are lifted up by it. They are energized. They're happier. And we tend to expect that people are going to react negatively to us when 90-something% of the time it's positive. It's this opportunity that we have to be intentional about taking. I'm really overjoyed that there are, faith communities and clubs that are saying, this is something we're going to prioritize. And so one of our communities in Idaho first talked, evangelical church, they first talked within the faith community, and then they invited people from the neighboring area to have conversations. And COVID happened, and things things moved to video. And all of a sudden now we have sister faith communities happening across the country. We have a church in Arkansas talking to a faith community in the Bay Area, and this is good. We have research that shows, in fact, that in-person and video conversations have both the short-term and longer-term impact we're looking for. And that you hone your skills in listening, because the power of listening is something it's easy to forget. I'm kind of surprised again and again by just how I always learn something new, and I get better at this when I do it. So it's a big ask to say, we want you to show up and be vulnerable and really talk to people. But it's an ask that's richly rewarded.
Thank you. Thank you, Joan. Murph and Dr. Eisler already had a chance to answer this question, but I'd like to give you a chance briefly. For our listeners, is there something that you would invite them to do that they can do, like say, even in the next 24 hours, that would be a step toward peace that's really, personal and actionable?
Well, yes, they could have a conversation. Less than that, they could just go to livingroomconversations.org and sign up and hear about conversations that are coming up that they could be part of if they wished. And we do now have all sides talks, where for people that don't have someone they're comfortable asking, they can join one of those and they can meet someone or some people, depending on if it's a one-on-one or 6-person conversation, with different viewpoints from different parts of the country. So we're creating more opportunities for people to connect all the time. And then as the holidays come, we have a whole menu of good questions that people can just have as part of their way of interacting with family and friends. Because the conversation agreements we have, they're great for the living room conversations, but they're actually great for our lives to be curious, to be respectful, to suspend judgment. And owning your part of the conversation and understanding that, that's the part of the conversation you can have control over. And it's a big contribution.
Thank you. Well, I think we'll almost close, but I just want to give Murph, is there any other message that you've wanted to make sure that you express today? Any closing remarks?
Yeah, again, like I had mentioned earlier, it takes a lot of energy to keep up ruckus, right? It takes a lot of mental dexterity to not choose peace and to choose something that could be, threatening to other individuals on a daily basis. I mean, you're literally shortening your lifespan by doing such. So, it's very important that we are flexible enough and vulnerable enough to look at things from a different perspective than which we've always known, that was taught to us, that was part of environments that once defined who we were, or who we were as a person. So in order for us to be able to combat that, we have to be open to evolve and not be the same person who others have come to know us as well as to a certain extent what we created for ourselves, if that specific person is not necessarily at this point in time satisfactory to you, right? So give ourselves permission to be empathetic to ourselves on the things that we didn't know, the things that we don't know, and seek to learn specifically about individuals that are different than you. Learn about the environment and how important that is to us as well, so we can, as a collective, make some positive changes to create a more sustainable, holistic society that is well. So that's the last thing that I have.
Thank you. And Joan, any last words, anything you would like to make sure to impart to our listeners?
Just that you make a big difference when you show up and have that attitude of wanting to listen to others. And even when you don't agree, it's confusing when you don't agree, but to take it in, be curious why, find a point of where you do connect, and then maybe add your own perspective if there's that opening there, and know that people don't change generally in a moment, but that it's about that relationship and that respectful exchange that softens things and begins to create movement.
Beautiful. Yes, we do have to give people a moment. I've never once found anybody changed in 1 second just because I gave them new information. It's not usually doesn't how it works. You just love them where they're at and give them that safe place if they want to ask questions and stuff. But
Loving them where they're at that's the heart of it.
yeah. And I also always feel like I want to teach, but I also want to be taught, and everybody brings something. So, well, I just we're going to close, and I just want to give my deep, heartfelt thanks to Frederick Murphy, Joan Blades, Dr. Riane Eisler, who had to go, but this was my and is my dream, because I think that this was my first time trying to put something like this together, so it's hard to be the first ones sometimes, and something like what's going on here. So I really appreciate that, and but what my vision is this leadership in the world, because it has occurred to me over and over that there are more peacemakers than not. If you think about the whole world, there most people just want to raise their families, be able to have their daily bread and have fun with their friends. Most of us are not interested in war. Like, numerically speaking, most of us don't want to be doing this. Like you said, Murph, it's actually easier to be at peace. It wastes so much energy trying not to be. And yet we're still in our historical moment, we're still under a few, or at least our own, well, like Dr. Eisler calls it, the systems that we've made our habits. And so I just want to keep raising up our leaders that are peacemakers, and inviting us all to inhabit that leadership in peace. And we covered a lot of themes, but there were actually quite a few connections. We talked about history and making sure we know our history at all, and maybe history that hasn't been told yet, so that there aren't people who aren't speaking. We need to be able to hear from everyone, and using that history to change our story, change our consciousness, as Dr. Eisler said. And then as you two have taken us a little further to maybe have some leadership and some risk taking into having conversations, and or actually being the listener, maybe not being so worried about what's coming out of our mouth, but to be the listener. And so I think we've actually gotten a really good foundation there and some really wonderful ideas. Again, thank you. And to our listeners, I would encourage you to, where you're watching this video, there's more information about each of our panelists, and I encourage you to follow what they're doing, participate in what they're doing, bring what they're doing into your community, in your life, and your community. And so that is all that I have. And thank you very much.
Thank you for the invite. It was great.
Thank you.